straight on a bit late. I do apologise. Anne is conference chair, and Anne Fry, Deputy Chief Executive of VON, over and out.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you to everyone for joining us. The agenda for today should be visible, so you can see the running order for the rest of the event. I'm going to give a brief introduction and then hand over to our speakers, Isabel Thomas and Roscoe. While we're hearing from our speakers, we'd like to invite you to ask questions you might have through Slido to be picked up during the panel session, which comes next. The instructions for this will be posted in the chat, so please go to Slido, use the code, and you can ask your questions and vote for other people's as well. VON has been working in the field of digital and innovation support for the VCSE sector for a number of years. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we increasingly heard from our members the challenges that they were encountering when delivering vital services to the people who needed them, and the myriad ways in which barriers to digital became barriers to services. We began to explore the issues in more depth and start to build an evidence base to help us to explain to external stakeholders what was happening in communities and in the sector. In our first COVID-19 impact report released in May 2020, we found that digital exclusion was a major factor in the prevalence of unmet needs in the region. In our second impact report, released in January 21, we found that situation hadn't improved at all. So back in June 2020, we held a roundtable to hear from our members in more depth what was happening and begin to identify themes and potential solutions. We became involved in the regional Better Connected campaign. And in late 2020, we worked with Not Equal at Newcastle University's Open Lab to host workshops with the sector at Newcastle, workshops with the sector facilitated by Parnaby, one of our panel speakers today. This resulted in a report released in early 2021, Tackling Digital Poverty in North East England, which has three main recommendations. The need for greater understanding of the complexity of the issues surrounding digital inclusion work, the need to foster a collaborative ecosystem of digital inclusion practitioners, and the need for greater training and engagement between the VCSE sector and digital technologists. VON was then contracted by the VCS Emergencies Partnership to work as one of 5 national subject liaison leads for digital inclusion. Working in partnership with 2 other infrastructure organisations, we mapped VCS digital inclusion activity across the North and produced a report titled Are We All Included?, which outlined a number of recommendations for the ecosystem of support from local through to national. Through our links into the North East LEP and their skills advisory panel, we raised awareness of the digital inclusion issue in the region, working with the Good Things Foundation and encouraging the panel to commission specific research on digital inclusion relating to skills, education, employment and the economy. And we're really happy to have both the Good Things Foundation and the North East LEP here with us today. As a strategic partner of Millfield House Foundation, we co-designed a research brief with other partners and IPPR North to address the regional data gap around the issues and contributed to their research, which was published in September this year. We're pleased to be joined by Roscoe from IPPR North to hear more about this. VON understands that people were digitally excluded pre-COVID, and the reason we chose this subject area for exploration through our annual conference now is because we know it's going to remain an issue for many. Digital exclusion received a great deal of news coverage during lockdowns, and despite the fact that it seems to have largely fallen off the news cycle, we're clear that it needs to remain on the radar of policymakers because it's an issue that is intrinsically about social justice. Digital inclusion is a gateway inclusion. If you can't access digital, you can't access housing, healthcare, education or employment. And it's an area in which our sector, our members, have a huge amount of expertise. There's a growing body of work highlighting how VCSE organisations work with people who are being excluded from the digital world and supporting them to access their basic human rights. VON calls on policy and decision makers to build on the work of our sector and engage with our sector at a strategic and direct delivery level so that our models and experience can be utilised. We're delighted to be joined today by some great examples of this work from across the North East region. Our speakers represent different areas of focus. We couldn't adequately cover every area we wanted to, or we would have had a panel larger than the audience here today. But we know that amongst our attendees, there are people who have a lot of direct experience and a high level of expertise. So we'd encourage you all to get involved in the conversation and let's all learn from each other. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Isabel Thomas. Isabel leads the Good Things Foundation's Community Engagement and Experience team, whose purpose is to grow and strengthen the Foundation's network of community partners, ensuring they and the people they work with benefit from the resources and support the charity offers. So Isabel, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you this morning. I'm just going to share my screen. So if you just bear with me. Hopefully you can now all see my presentation. Yeah, brilliant. I see some thumbs up. That's wonderful. So I am really pleased to be here discussing this incredibly important subject with you all today. As Anne said, digital inclusion should be treated as a basic human right, and we absolutely support that ambition. It is one of the most pressing needs of our time. It's unacceptable that in the 21st century, so many people cannot get online and access all the benefits of the internet. So this morning, I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to go through the national data set, what we know at a national picture, and what that data is telling us. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Good Things Foundation does, how we work, and importantly, how we can support community organisations. I know that many of you here will be working to support people to be digitally included, and I'll be talking a bit about the support and resources that we provide. We are a leading digital inclusion charity in the UK. We also work in Australia, and our vision is a world where everybody benefits from digital, but it isn't sort of being online for being online's sake. It's about what this can help people to achieve. It's about individual goals, helping people to be healthier, happier, and better off. So I'm not going to run through all of this data on this screen. Hopefully my slides will be shared with you after the conference. But it's really clear that there is still a huge problem in the UK. And the data shows, well, the data speaks for itself. I'm going to pick out a couple of things that really jump out to me. So the fact that there are 10 million adults in the UK who still don't have the most basic digital skills is stark. And the fact that 6% of households don't have access to the internet. And unsurprisingly, that percentage or that proportion of households increases if you look at low-income families. And as Anne said in her introduction, this drives social and economic inequality. Again, there's lots of data on this slide. I'm not going to read through it all, but the fact that 92% of employers want their employees to have basic digital skills is a really crucial one for me. It means that if you aren't online and you don't have those basic skills, you're being shut out of the workforce. And the other thing that this data shows is that if you are online, you tend to be better off because you tend to have a higher earning power and you can make significant savings on things like utilities. So it's absolutely crucial that we keep this on the agenda and that we keep pushing for change to fix the digital divide. So I am sure that you are all familiar with the fact that age and poverty are key factors in digital exclusion. But it is important to say that this isn't just something that affects older people. Older people are absolutely impacted by digital exclusion, but you can see the statistics on this slide that 39% of people who are offline are under 60. So a lot of people who need the support to get the access and the skills are actually working age adults. And what's been really interesting to see during the pandemic is that digital engagement has decreased for some groups of people, particularly if you look at people living in poverty, people with health conditions and disabilities. Their engagement with digital has declined during the various lockdowns of the pandemic. So yes, some of the data has shown us that more people have used or built their digital skills, but there is also a group of people for whom this has not been the case. And there is a big regional difference if you look at the data. So we had some analysis done of Ofcom data from 2021 that shows that there is a 10 percentage point difference between the proportion of limited users in the northeast and those in the southeast. And this is really important to note. It should be considered as digital inclusion should be considered as part of the levelling up agenda. It's absolutely vital that we raise this with policymakers and make it really clear that it's part of levelling up. So I'm not going to pause for very long on this. Some of you may have seen this infographic before, but every year Good Things Foundation produces an infographic on all the different data sets relating to digital inclusion. You can find this on our website. It's got lots of information about the sort of different groups of people who are excluded, who are included, and my slides have a link to that on our website. So what do we do and how do we do it as a charity? And this is really important. You know, what can we offer you as community organisations, as the voluntary community and social enterprise sector? There's a host of resources and support that we provide. But put simply, what do? We work in partnership with others to fix the digital divide, both here and in Australia. And we see digital equity as a hierarchy of need, a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of need. And there are these three things that make up that hierarchy of need. So we've got people need a device for personal use, free or affordable internet access, whether that's data or broadband, and then support with getting the skills, the motivation and the confidence to use the device and use the data to get online and improve their lives. And at Good Things Foundation, we work in all of these areas. So if we're talking about devices, during the first lockdown in 2020, we saw the huge need for devices, and we worked in partnership to stand up a service that distributed devices to community organisations across the UK. We worked with funding partners to bring in funding to be able to buy those devices and to provide some data with them. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that we are launching a national data bank, which is about getting free data to people who need it the most. So you may have seen O2's latest Christmas advert. This is the advert talks about how O2 will give data packages into the national data bank for every package that their customers buy or new customers buy between now and the end of January. We've had a pilot of the data bank in the last few months, and we're hoping to roll that out more widely across the UK from the new year. And then skills and confidence and motivation. We achieve this through our free learning platform. So I'll come and talk about that. I'll get onto those in a minute. But we also provide research and resources around how to help people, how to build their motivation and their confidence. So one of the really, really key ways that we work is in partnership with community organisations across the country, thousands of community organisations, because you are the people who are the trusted organisations, the trusted faces in local communities who build relationships with local people and provide the flexible personal support that people who are digitally excluded really need to be able to help them to get online. So we call this the Online Centres Network. I'm sure there are quite a few members of that network here today. And I just wanted to mention a bit about the benefits of being a member. So it's free to join. We provide resources, training, support to help organisations embed digital inclusion into the work that they do. So we really see this as embedded is really important. It shouldn't be a bolt-on, although training courses absolutely have a role to play. But for example, I know of organisations who use it in social groups, who I can think of an organisation in Salford who have a walking group, who were thinking about how they could introduce digital into their walking group through planning routes. So it's often about finding the hook, the interest for organisations, and we provide support around, the hook for individuals to help with motivation for getting online, and we provide support around that. We provide grant funding to our community partners, and I just want to pause, and some of you may have seen that we have been successful in securing funding through the Community Renewal Fund for the North of Tyne region, and we will very shortly be releasing details of that, which will enable community organisations to apply for grant funding with us to deliver on that, to build digital skills amongst a certain cohort of individuals. The model for this is we're testing out how you can build a pathway between that initial engagement and support with basic digital skills in a community setting, and to work out how to help people to achieve progression into employability, but in particular into further education, colleges, and into how people can actually take up that formal offer, the free offer of essential digital skills qualifications. So if you're not already a member of the Online Centres Network and you think this could be something for your organisation, then please get in touch with me and I can point you in the direction of how to join. But we will be sharing more information shortly about how that how this programme is going to work and the funding that's going to be available. Learn My Way is another key resource that we offer. It is a basic digital skills learning platform. There are over 30 courses on here that take you through from how to use a mouse, how to switch on a device, through to things like online banking, how to improve your health online. It's an absolutely fantastic resource. If you are a member of the Online Centres Network, you also then get tutor access. I use tutor in the loosest possible way. This doesn't have to be somebody who is a formal, trained teacher necessarily, but if you are supporting people to get online and you're a member of the network, there are lots of tutor resources on there that people can access. We also have another platform called Make It Click, which is aimed more at limited users of the internet and particularly around digital skills for work. The final thing that I want to tell you about is the research and advocacy that we do as a charity. We are really core to our mission is making sure that we understand what digital exclusion means. We understand what the sort of what it is behind the national data set that is important about how to support people, what are the actions we need to take to address, and crucially our research team looks at evaluating programs that we run funded by our national funding partners. But in terms of advocacy, the key thing that I want you to be aware of, that this year we have produced a blueprint to fix the digital divide in the UK, and we're calling for 3 things from policymakers. We want a national plan to be able to upskill the 10 million people who don't have basic digital skills, and this needs to be a partnership approach. No one organisation can fix this. We need a partnership, but crucially we need leadership from government. So that lots of government departments touch on digital inclusion, but there needs to be a national plan led by government. And so that we don't see siloed working across the government departments. We want to see a bigger network of digital inclusion across the UK. Our ambition is for every community to have a place where people can go to get the support that they need. And the third thing we're calling for is an end to data poverty by 2024. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to our discussion and to really understanding what it is your experience of digital inclusion is, how you're helping people, and what more we can do as a charity to help.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Isabel, for taking the time to join us today and tell us more about your work. Just a reminder to use Slido to submit any questions that we'll pick up during the next session. I think there was a lot in there, in particular, seeing this as part of the levelling up agenda, I think is really key. And we look forward to seeing more of your work in the North East over the coming months. The data disparity sort of struck out for me in terms of what's happening in the North East, which brings us nicely onto the next speaker. So Erica Roscoe. Erica is a senior research fellow at IPPR North and leads their programme of work in the North East. Most recently, Erica's worked on projects looking at digital exclusion and disability across the North and co-authored the research report addressing digital exclusion in North East England. So Erica, over to you.
Thanks very much, Anne. And I've presented this research on a couple of times now alongside a presentation from the Good Things Foundation, and it's great to do because it's just there's a danger of sort of violently agreeing with one another, but it's great to kind of see things from slightly different perspectives. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hopefully you can all see my purple screen now.
Yeah.
Great. So as Anne said, I recently co-authored the report on digital exclusion in the North East, commissioned by Vaughan and other partners from Millfield House through the Millfield House Strategic Partnership. So there's quite an awful lot in this presentation, so I'm just going to try and provide a summary of the key findings and the recommendations, but recognise that there's an awful lot more to it. So when we first started looking at digital exclusion and what digital exclusion means, we thought about how do we define digital exclusion, and whilst so often when you start looking at digital exclusion, you get this idea of a digital divide of you're either excluded or you're not. We quickly came to realise that that's actually not the case always, because digital is so embedded within our lives that somebody might have a smartphone and be able to check the football scores and update their social media, but put them in front of a laptop or a desktop computer and ask them to fill in a universal credit form, and they might not know where to start, how to use a keyboard and things. So actually it's much more complex than just excluded or included, and there's much more to it than just having a device or having the skills. So we started to try and unpick that and understand some of these complexities as a starting point for our research. And what we came up with based on existing research and trying to understand how people had tried to address this previously was to try and define digital exclusion as a lack of access or ability to engage in digital activity, which excludes people from equal opportunities to engage in social, political or economic life. And we characterise this by a lack of connectivity, both in terms of infrastructure and affordable devices, and affordability, lack of access to devices, and by this we mean appropriate devices. So if anybody was homeschooling children during the pandemic, you will have known that a smartphone wasn't necessarily the most suitable device to be trying to homeschool, especially if you've only got one smartphone between 3 children. So that is not what we class as a suitable device. A lack of skills and confidence, and this includes things like online safety as well, and then online accessibility. And by this we mean lack of inclusive online design for people with specific access needs. So an example might be people with visual impairments using screen readers, and if the website kind of doesn't work with those screen readers, then that makes them digitally excluded. So once we'd got an idea of what we were taking to mean as digital exclusion, and that complex and broad definition of digital exclusion, we then set about trying to understand what is the extent of digital exclusion in the North East. And we quickly realised that using such a broad definition, whilst we felt that it was appropriate to understand digital exclusion, made things very difficult to measure, of course. And the figures that we've seen from the presentation that Isabel gave are really helpful, I think, in giving some context. But actually, when you start to try and overlap these different factors, different skills levels and devices and connections, it becomes very challenging to understand the real scale of the problem. So what we did was we used some data, the Digital Exclusion Risk Index, which again was something that Isabel referenced in her presentation, to try and understand things a little bit better. And what this does is it uses risk factors such as age, broadband connection, average download speed, and deprivation to try and offer an indication of risk of digital exclusion by combining all of those factors. And you can see from this graph on the right hand side here that the darker shades across the region are where there are higher, where there's a higher risk of digital exclusion. And we can see these really dark patches right across the region, right from the north, where perhaps there's some factors at play like rural location, maybe challenges around broadband connection, through to some of the more coastal areas and more sort of urban areas as well, where there might be the factors that perhaps coming into play there might be more around deprivation. So we can see that there's a number of areas across the region that have really high risk of digital exclusion, and it'd be good to try and understand a bit more about why those areas have such high risk of digital exclusion. So then what we looked at in that research was trying to understand why people were experiencing digital exclusion. And the research led us to understand that there are many reasons why people might experience digital exclusion, but often there are groups that tend to be disproportionately affected. And those are groups that are already marginalised in society. So groups like disabled people, asylum seekers, people living in rural locations, and people experiencing poverty are likely to be more at risk of experiencing digital exclusion. But what we also found as we did the research was that actually it's often a gateway exclusion. What we mean by this is that it prevents people from fully engaging in modern life. So it affects people who are already at risk of marginalisation, but not only that, it exacerbates that risk of marginalisation as well. And during the pandemic, what we saw was a number of services shift from physical in-person services to digital, because that seemed to be the only option very early on in the pandemic. This brought about lots of shifts from things that were perhaps already starting to move online, through to things that perhaps were previously considered not suitable for being kind of online digital services, such as social care crisis support or school parents' evenings. And what we're really concerned about in terms of the impact of the pandemic on digital exclusion is that as we return to this version of normality that many of us are returning to, we're concerned that any support that people might have had who were digitally excluded, much of that support is now being withdrawn. However, many of the services that shifted online during the pandemic realised that they could work online, they were perhaps more efficient working online. So many of those face-to-face services that digitally excluded people may have accessed prior to the pandemic, may have had some support with over the pandemic, and then now are likely to be faced with no face-to-face services, but equally no support to try and access those services online either. So we think that that's a real risk, that you know, maybe it's sort of a permanent shift, and potentially a real challenge for people who are facing digital exclusion. So then what we looked at was what was being done to try and address this issue, and we looked at sort of national programs. We spoke with people from the Good Things Foundation. We tried to understand all about the different programs that were ongoing. But in the Northeast particularly, we identified a number of examples of really good practice that were being undertaken prior to the pandemic and during, including things like the digital skills training that was being coordinated by the North of Tyne Combined Authority, Newcastle Future's Tyne Online programme, and then some work with the Elders Council in partnership with Northumbria University, among many others. And however, one thing that we saw through trying to understand what was being done is that there were a number of issues and barriers that precluded people from trying to address this issue more fully. One of these barriers was a lack of ownership in the digital inclusion agenda. And what we found was that this, as Isabel said, this exists at a national level. There needs to be sort of national leadership on this, and currently there isn't. So what that means is that digital inclusion initiatives are quite often quite piecemeal, and they're owned by different departments. So there's a lack of sort of coordination and understanding of the whole picture of digital exclusion. And another challenge that we identified was that, again, using that really broad definition of digital exclusion, it meant that there was quite a lack of data to try and understand the problem. And therefore it was really difficult to try and really target you know, the communities and the people who were most likely to be affected by this. So what we did identify was that there were a wealth of enthusiastic and hugely committed people who were working across the region to try and support those who needed it. Many of those people working across the voluntary community sector to try and support people who needed it. But that lack of ownership meant that there was nobody really driving the agenda from a national or from a sort of regional perspective. So we came up with 6 kind of key areas of recommendations, and those recommendations aim to address the 5 key challenges that we'd identified around digital exclusion, and they were access to devices, connectivity, digital skills and confidence in navigating the digital landscape, online safety, and inclusive design. And we would argue that all of these challenges need to be addressed in order to successfully combat digital exclusion. If you just kind of take one of them and try and address those, then you're inevitably going to be faced with challenges relating to the other issues, or you know, people who are experiencing digital exclusion are likely to be faced with other challenges that perhaps wouldn't be foreseen. So we need to consider them as a whole. So I'll just briefly talk through those 6 themes that we came up with in terms of our recommendations. So the first area, the action area as we called it, was around collaboration and integration. And by this we mean the importance of partnership with public, private, VCSE sector organisations to try and deliver initiatives. And also making sure that digital inclusion is integrated as part of other strategies, so things like poverty reduction strategies. Digital inclusion needs to be embedded as part of that. And then we also talked about agreement of minimum digital standard. That's something that's agreed across all of these different partners and different organisations. There's a shared language and a shared understanding of what's necessary and what's that minimum standard that people should be working towards. Action area 2 is around guidance, support and informal learning opportunities. By this, really we're putting the spotlight on VCSE organisations here, because again, as Isabel mentioned, VCSE organisations are often the people and the organisations who are at the heart of communities. They really understand what people need, what kind of support people need. They understand that often telling people to go to a classroom environment to learn digital skills, that might not work, but actually something that's perhaps in their own community, within their own community, community hall or something like that might be a much better environment for people to be open and willing to adopt those digital skills. But our key point here is that this shouldn't be left just to the VCSE sector. The VCSE sector perhaps might be the best place to deliver this support, but by no means should it be delivering the support by itself. It needs to be done in partnership with local, regional and national government, and the VCSE sector needs to be really heavily supported in order to deliver these initiatives. So where's the sort of the delivery organisations, they're not doing it by themselves. For action area 3, we talked about a minimum standard of access. I mentioned this briefly in the first point, but here we're talking about particularly trying to promote a minimum standard of access. We're advocating that government should be working with providers to ensure a minimum basic connection for everybody. We're also talking about things like ensuring that everybody has a suitable device that they can access the internet with. So this could be done through things like redistribution schemes or loan schemes. So there's a number of options here to try and support that minimum standard of access. And action area 4 is around a digital safety net. So by this, we're talking about ensuring that signposting is in place to digital support provision. And this should be in place at any touch point. So if somebody is trying to pay their council tax and can't do that because they can't get online, and so they engage with a local authority, then that should be identified that they weren't able to do that because they weren't able to get online, and digital provision should be signposted to as a result. So it should be sort of something that's being flagged and coming up consistently as sort of an essential thing that needs to be identified whenever there's any engagement with local or national authority representatives, I suppose. And then action area 5 is around inclusive service design. And I mentioned this throughout the presentation, talking about the need to ensure that internet provision and websites, for example, are designed so that they are inclusive for everybody. And there needs to be consideration of how people will access a website, how people will use it, and what barriers people might face. Not just what barriers you might face, but what barriers other people might face as well. People who already have particular access challenges. But one thing that we would say as part of this, and a key point of part of this, is that particularly for public service provision, we should ensure that digital is not the only option, is never the only option. So it might be that you design a digital service and you can design it to be as inclusive as you like, but inevitably there'll always be somebody who can't access that service for whatever reason, because you won't have thought of a particular challenge that they'll be facing. So we would really advocate that digital by default is not the answer. There always needs to be a suitable offline option as well. And then last but not least, our action area 6 is around embedding digital skills across all subject areas. And whilst our research wasn't hugely focused on digital skills for education and for young people and children, we did identify that actually that's where many people get their digital skills from. Whilst they need to keep developing them throughout their lives, they need to have that really strong basis to begin with. But as I've said, digital is embedded across whole lives pretty much, from buying a train ticket to checking the sports scores. So that should be the same within education. Digital skills should be embedded across the whole curriculum, so that children understand the digital world and can properly navigate the digital landscape. In addition, we would argue that it should be the digital skills that are offered to children and taught to children are not just focused on that professional environment. So it's not just about things like how to write a professional email, but also sort of more, I suppose, life skills, things like where to go to get support for health, how to find details, local council services, obviously, appropriate for the age of the child and things like that. But making sure that they have a good understanding of what's on offer online and how to access those kinds of services. So I'll stop there. And really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Erica. I think the IPPR North research really adds a great deal to our understanding of the issues and meets a real data gap at a regional level. I found it really useful, so thanks to you and your colleagues. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Carol Bottom, who's going to introduce our panel speakers and invite them to give a short introductory contribution to the topic from their own perspectives. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Anne. I hope you can see the slide, so you can see who our 6 panel speakers are. You have been sent information about who they are and what they're going to be touching on. But I think I just want to say, by way of introduction, we have both of our speakers and Anne in her introduction have talked about how this is a very complex issue and affects different people, different communities and different facets of our lives in different ways. And so through this panel, we're hoping to bring out a flavour of that across our 6 speakers. So I'm going to firstly invite Paul to speak. We are running a bit behind time, so I'm going to be quite fierce with you about keeping to your 5 minutes. And just to remind you again that if you want to ask any questions, we'll have some time for questions at the end of the 6 speakers on the panel. Please do use Slido to go and submit your questions or vote up and like questions that are already there. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and invite Paul to speak first.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Sorry, I've not spoken on this for a while. Great. So I'd just like to talk about the project that we set up a couple of years ago, which is it's going really well now. So it's called Get Connected. It's a broadband service that we wanted to set up to help people get connected. And we based it on the work that we do in Hartlepool, supporting people with their energy bills. So we help a lot of people that top up their meters. So it's a case of people paying for energy before they've used it, and that's quite a common way for a lot of people to pay for their energy bills. So we sort of nicked that idea and built a broadband service around it. So we registered as we're a registered ISP, if that means anything to anybody, and we are a not-for-profit. So we've developed a broadband in a box service that is £20 a month, no contract. There's no need for a landline, and we don't do any credit checks on anybody applying for the service. So the router that we've chosen looks like that. I hope people can see that. It's probably not very good because of the blaring, but everyone's seen a router. The special thing about this one is that, as I'd mentioned, it doesn't need a landline. So we drop ship this to any customer. We can supply them anywhere in the UK, and it's a case of plugging it into the mains. We tell people to put it upstairs so it's near a window to connect to the 4G network, and then it's a case of the customer, that house has got Wi-Fi. We use the 4G network, and we can see speeds of between about 5 and 50 meg. It really depends on where you live, and we do offer a sort of an unlimited data package so that people don't run out of data. The important thing for us was the safeguarding side of the service. We're connecting a lot of people that have never been connected to the internet before. So we invested quite heavily in what's called an advanced content filter. So it just keeps out all of the nasties, keeps people safe. And that comes as standard with any connection that we provide to a customer, and it's always on. People can remove it, but it's on as default. So what are we doing sort of right now? Well, we're heading to about very close to 1,000 customers, which we're really pleased about. As I said, we're delivering this across the UK. We've got a number of customers down in London. We've got schools across the country, local authorities. Fantastically, a lot of VCS orgs have taken the service on and are then helping their members and their users to connect up. And then locally, we really want to now expand on our DigiBuddy service. So that's the helping people to do all the other bits that come with broadband. So it's great that we've got Wi-Fi into somebody's house, but sort of then what? How do people connect the devices and install apps and use the internet? The other side of our projects that we're about to launch is supporting the deaf community. We're just about to launch a fully signed video to support that. I'm hoping to get that out in December. And then locally, on a sort of a jobs perspective, we want to expand our team. So all of these connections bring with it a reason to ring in and speak to us. We're all the team's based in Hartlepool. I'm really proud that we're generating and creating local jobs in a field that's quite new. It's digital, and that's kind of where we are. That's 4 minutes and 53 seconds, Carol.
Amazing. Thank you ever so much, Paul. I knew I could rely on you to stay at time, and you set the bar for all our other speakers. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to invite Amanda Bailey from the North East Child Poverty Commission for her contribution, focusing on children and young people, as you might expect.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I think I'm in danger of repeating or mirroring quite a lot of what's been said before, particularly by Anne and by the Good Things Foundation and by Erica. But I think, we all know it's unsurprising that the North East is likely to have higher levels of digital exclusion than the rest of England. And of course, as people have said, this was an issue for our region well before anyone had even heard of COVID-19. We all know that we had really high and pre-existing levels of poverty and deprivation in the North East, which, as Erica has suggested and others, is one of the key factors in determining someone's likelihood of being digitally excluded. It's not the only factor, but it's one of the key factors. And as many of you may know, our region had, for example, the second highest rate of child poverty of anywhere in the UK pre-COVID. We also experienced the country's steepest increases in child poverty in the years leading into the pandemic. So the fact that there are many families and children and young people affected by this issue is clearly not surprising. I think our principal concern, and it's been said earlier as well, is given the increasingly kind of all-encompassing nature of the digital world, it's deeply concerning that digital exclusion is effectively adding yet another layer of disadvantage to those who are already facing significant inequalities and restricted opportunities, including children and young people who are growing up in the grip of poverty in the North East. And again, as has been said before, this problem is described as a gateway exclusion because it causes additional forms of exclusion to people who are already likely to be marginalised. And that can be families who are struggling to claim universal credit and then to keep up with their reporting requirements because, of course, the system is digital by default, or whether that's being able to bid for a home via social housing portals, or indeed parents being able to apply for a job or a better paid role through which to support their children. The impact of digital exclusion has obviously been felt particularly acutely by children and young people during the pandemic. As I said, it was an issue before then, but I think it's been particularly acutely felt during the pandemic, and especially during times when COVID-related restrictions have been especially onerous. And that's not just in relation to remote learning, although clearly that has been one of the biggest challenges. But it's also about being able to access support services and things like extracurricular activity or clubs that moved online. And of course, being able to keep in touch and socialise with family and friends, which is increasingly difficult, or has felt increasingly difficult for people during the worst parts of the pandemic. And as we've heard before, there's no doubt that a significant amount of activity has taken place, particularly last year, I think, and in the early part of this year, to address this issue for children and young people. And in the North East, for example, that's been done by the Department for Education, combined authorities, local enterprise partnerships, individual local authorities, the Northern Powerhouse Partnership as part of a campaign that was coordinated by regional media, business organisations, individual businesses, schools, multi-academy trusts, and of course, very important given today's platform, by charities and community organisations as well. However, I think we feel that this kind of apparently ad hoc patchwork, entirely non-strategic approach, which raises a number of concerns, which we fed into IPPR North's report, as despite the problem that we all know that still exists, it is still unclear whether any organisation at any level of government is responsible for identifying the digital gaps which remain for children and young people in the North East. It's still unclear whether any organisation is responsible for then addressing those digital gaps for children and young people in the North East and within any kind of time frame. It's not clear whether any organisation is responsible for not just providing appropriate devices, and appropriate being really important for children and young people, internet access and data, but also providing the necessary skills to use equipment and to provide any ongoing technical support. And all of the different initiatives I've mentioned to support children and young people with digital access all appear to have had quite different approaches to long-term ownership of devices. So, for example, in some cases, they've remained with families. In others, they've remained with schools or colleges, or in some cases with the authority which initially supplied them, which I think risks creating further inequalities where some people have been taken out of digital exclusion and some were for a short period, but not in the long term. So ultimately, as everyone has said, we know the digital divide was already an issue for many children and young people pre-COVID. It's a problem that's been highlighted and significantly exacerbated by the pandemic, which in turn has exacerbated other long-standing challenges, such as the attainment gap between children from the lowest income families and their peers. And we know that the North East, for example, has experienced some of the country's biggest learning losses as a result of COVID-19. But we also know that a proper plan for digital inclusion is not an issue for the pandemic, and it's only going to get more, not less important for children and young people in the North East. As schools increasingly move, for example, homework and all of their communications with parents online, as children and young people need to develop digital skills in order to get on in life, to apply for a job, an apprenticeship and a university place, indeed to access virtually any public service, and of course to socialise with friends and family. And so we would echo, what's been said before, that it really should be a long-term strategic aim to end digital exclusion for all groups, and particularly children and young people in the North East, if we're serious about creating an inclusive economy, which we hear about quite a lot, or indeed levelling up. And I think the ad hoc patchwork approach we've seen to date, whilst understandable at the beginning of a pandemic, just doesn't wash as we plan for recovery. And to give an example, today the government is finally publishing its integrated rail plan, Perhaps the less said about that, the better. And it remains to be seen what that will actually mean for the North East. But where's the integrated digital inclusion plan? You know, why is this not being addressed as a national strategic priority? And who exactly has ownership of this issue, whether within national government or within the region? So I'd echo the comments before about really needing a national plan. But in the continued absence of this, I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's views about how we work together as a region to make it a strategic priority for children and young people in the North East.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Lots of food for thought there, and I think you very eloquently put across how this is absolutely key for children and young people in our region, and that point about strategic coordination. If we're not going to get it from national government, what can we do regionally to try and help that in the short term, whilst we lobby for the national government to be doing more strategically about this? Thank you so much, Amanda. Right, on to Andy Dean now from Community Action Northumberland, who's going to be talking from a more rural perspective for us. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Me appearing on screen was your sign. Your time was up, Amanda. I'll look for the next person after me. So just to kick off, I'm going to pinch Erica's phrase and violently agree with everything everybody's said so far. But just to, yeah, as I say, I'm here to give a bit of rural flavour and context to the debate. First thing people will obviously think about from a rural perspective is connectivity. Massive issue, you know, whether it's broadband connectivity, mobile connectivity, it always tends to be the rural areas, the more remote areas that are last to be connected, last to be upgraded to the latest thing. So there's been a massive effort over many years to actually to improve that situation, which is eating and nibbling away at that, you know, from all levels, from government down to very local, and that's good. But there's still a lot of work to be done on that. But it mustn't be forgotten in connectivity terms that for us in Northumberland, that actually also includes connectivity to the mains electricity grid. So there are just over 350 households in Northumberland off the electricity grid. And if you're generating electricity from solar panels, from wind turbines, or more often than not from burning oil, it's quite a precious commodity, and quite often charging a laptop, charging the phone are quite low down that list. So that's another element of connectivity from a rural context, which is probably more unique to Northumberland in the English context than most other counties. We've certainly got more in that category. There's a film on our website. We're going to have a look at what that means for people living in that sort of circumstance. But getting away from connectivity, some of the other kind of key issues just that influence the digital inclusion debates in Northumberland, in rural areas, are around the cost of delivering anything. It's higher delivering any sort of service, any sort of product in a rural area. The distances are further, there's less people. And actually, we had our AGM earlier in the year. We're 70 years old early in the week. We're 70 years old this year, and we were reflecting back up through that period. And there's so much stuff around in the 50s and 60s in rural areas around declining services, which has just carried on and on and on. And obviously, as has been referred to, the pandemic has added again to that in terms of physical services being present in communities. It's been going on in rural areas for such a long time, and therefore the need to be digitally engaged is even more important. And if you're not, you're missing out even more, and you're excluded even more. And that's what happens in a lot of our rural communities, unfortunately. So there's that. Aging population, populations in rural areas are already older, proportionately more old than urban areas, and are getting older faster. Obviously has implications in terms of adoption of new technologies, etc. Income as well, which often doesn't really get thought about so much in a rural context, but average earnings in predominantly rural areas are less than in predominantly urban areas, and low pay and poverty in work is a significant issue. So you won't see, you know, IMD stats that are higher in rural areas. You won't see unemployment, generally speaking, that's higher in rural areas. But what you will see is a lot more jobs in lower paid occupations proportionately. So, you know, hospitality, tourism, agriculture, care, etc., etc. So a big issue. And if you've got less money, it's harder to pay for things. And quite often one of the things to drop off is your broadband payment. And overall, thing I always bang on about from a rural context is just the simple fact that the numbers are smaller, there's less people. So any service provider across any sector, you know, private, public, voluntary, it's really hard to deliver a service to a few people that are miles away. It costs more, and it's hard to actually put the funding together to achieve that. And that goes for sort of programs as well. When we see strategic programs, government, regional, local authority, others come along, they don't mean to, but because they've got targets to hit, and there's a cost per output that has to be generated, very often it's too expensive to do it. It's seen to be too expensive to do it in a rural context. So big issue for us is how we actually make sure that anything that comes along does take that into account. And final thing, just in terms of something that we're doing at the minute, we've been doing this year, and it refers to something that's been said before. We, with the university, Newcastle University, undertook a digital review of village halls and community buildings, because there are already some of them acting as sort of digital hubs for local communities in terms of a lot of things that Erica was talking about in the IPPR research there. But there's a lot of opportunities to do more. So that report has explored actually what they can do to become those centres, that places that people can use, get training just to do some of that informal stuff, you know, the coffee mornings, the Zoom events, whatever it might be. And that's something that we are moving forward with in one's part of Northumberland at the moment in terms of implementing the next stage of that. So I think there's a big opportunity for some of those smaller communities to use those facilities in that context. Next person's appeared, I shall stop.
That's great, Andy. Thank you for that perspective. It's really important for this region. You know, let's not forget, large chunks of this region are rural, and we need to be fully aware of the particular challenges that those people and communities face. And I think your work around how can we revitalise village halls in a digital age and use those kind of physical assets to help and become kind of digital assets at the same time is great. And we look forward to hearing more about that as that work continues. So thank you. Next up, we have Jacob Lant, who's joined us from Health Watch England. And no surprises, Jacob is going to talk to us about the links between digital exclusion and health inequalities. So over to you, Jacob.
Thank you very much. You can hear me, yes, I'm off mute, excellent. So I'm Jacob, I'm the Head of Policy and Research at Health Watch England. And I just wanted to share some of the findings of work that we've done over the last year or so on digital health services and its links to health inequalities. I mean, it's unsurprising really that we've ended up focusing a lot on this in the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, because of the pandemic and how it's driven services online in the health sector. So we've actually ended up doing, I think, 4 different projects on it across that time period. And it started right after the first lockdown, really. We saw the rapid shift to moving appointments online and remote services. And we knew that the system would need to hear feedback from people very, very quickly in order to know what was working and what wasn't. So we mobilised, and I think in May, June time of 2020, we produced our first report on this, saying what is working and what isn't for people. And what was really interesting is how it helped us challenge some of the, what I will describe as quite lazy assumptions that the NHS often makes about who is excluded. So in particular, we heard from people living in rural communities and older people who really were engaging well with new online services. And the NHS had traditionally thought, well, you know, there's rubbish broadband in rural areas, so that's not going to work. And old people don't know how to use tech. And I think actually those are really lazy and unhelpful assumptions, because those are the people talking to us saying it's really actually working quite well for them, certainly in the initial phase of the pandemic. I think then later on, though, it was very clear that we've shifted into a model where people are more sceptical about how online services are working in health. And we've seen more inequalities for people who have sensory impairments, more inequalities for people who have English as an additional language. So we've had some real barriers that have become apparent in the later work that we've done. And that's seen in some of the increasing negativity around access to GPs. I think also on that note, it's just the technology itself that's causing problems here. It's the lack of communications about the technology, how it's changed. It's the barriers of getting through on the phone in the first place to book a digital appointment, or the website not working. It's not actually the delivery of the health service itself that's the problem, but all these routes in are causing challenges for people. So I want to make that point about, we've made some lazy assumptions that have been challenged about who is excluded, and also actually that over time, whilst it started off quite positively, I think we are shifting to a place where people are less confident and are more affected by the sudden shift to digital and the continuation of that. We have done a report most recently on groups that we think are the most excluded by the shift to digital. We made a number of recommendations in that report, principally talking about the need for a hybrid system of digital and face-to-face appointments, and that who gets what appointment shouldn't be decided purely by clinicians. People have lots of different reasons why they might need a face-to-face appointment rather than a digital one, and they need to have that choice made available to them. We've talked about investing in training and support and providing technology for people. We'll talk more about that in the conversation later. We talked about clarifying patients' rights to remote care, and actually the need for the system to record people's preferences so that we understand when we're engaging with patients each time, what are their needs that are going to help them engage digitally, what additional support do we need to put in place. If we don't have that in the records, how are we going to know each time we engage with them? And then final point, because I know I'm sort of pushed for time, we've talked very much about digital inclusion and treating access to the internet needs to be a universal right. I know the House of Lords COVID committee made this recommendation earlier the year, and we fully support that we really need to be thinking about how we link this as access to digital as a fundamental right, because the NHS has gone digital. It's not going to change back to how it was. And if we don't facilitate digital inclusion, then those people are going to have significantly worse health outcomes, and it's going to make things a lot worse than better. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Adam. And I think that point about digital needing to be a fundamental right for everyone, I think is really key and has come out from a lot of our speakers. So thanks for reiterating that again. Right, next up we have Adam Parnaby from Open Lab at Newcastle University, who's been doing a lot of work that Anne spoke about earlier in terms of supporting the sector to have conversations about digital inclusion and how we can work together more effectively to combat this issue. So over to you, Adam.
Hello, thank you very much. So yes, I'm Adam. I am a doctoral candidate at Open Lab in Newcastle University School of Computing, which is a fancy way of saying I'm a PhD student. So my research is in the field of human-computer interaction. So I'm coming from the background of being a technologist, a designer of digital things, a maker of digital things. And really my research is fundamentally asking the question, what is a constructive role for people who make technology, people who design user experiences in tackling this issue? And the particular line of inquiry that I'm pursuing for that is working with you all lovely people in the VCSE sector, because you know your communities a damn sight better than, say, the people who are building Facebook do. I've done some work which has already been highlighted, particularly working very closely with Anne on the Tackling Digital Poverty report. And based on that work, I am now looking at starting early next year, doing some design work based on some things that were suggested in those workshops to think about what me as a sort of archetypal user experience, user interface person can do to provide tools for you all to coordinate, to share your experiences, to share data and case studies, and to mobilize those things purposefully to address some of the challenges in your practice. Because what really came out of that report is that practice in the VCSE sector is very good. You all know what you're doing, obviously. And the problems that you're experiencing frequently are external. They are problems with policymakers not getting it, or with technologists not being engaged. So the question then becomes, how can we use the amazing stories and data and case studies that you all have? How can we collectively make sense of that and use that to put pressure on those people to do what needs doing and to make the changes that need making? So if anyone is interested in getting involved in that early next year, please do get in contact with me. I'll put my details in the chat when I'm done talking. Also, being as I am an indolent academic with the luxury of being able to sit back and do a lot of armchair thinking while you're all doing the hard work, I'm also thinking more broadly about some of the thorny ethical issues that are involved in doing digital inclusion, including some questions that I think have been highlighted quite well by some previous speakers and also in Slido, which I'm really looking forward to digging into, around what do we do when someone doesn't want to be digitally included? How do we, in the spirit of co-production and valuing lived experience, respect that decision whilst also doing what we think is in the best interests of beneficiaries of VCSE services. And also thinking more broadly, and again, this is something that previous speakers have highlighted, about why is it that digital is so necessary? Why is there this one way of being with regards to doing everything in a digital way that we have prioritized so highly? And to what degree is that about the best interests of service users, and to what degree is that about saving costs and providing some pressure to preserve these offline routes and providing a more kind of pluralistic service design that means that there are multiple ways of having relationships with technology that we can support? I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Adam, and how delightful it is to have somebody from a technology background saying digital by default is not the answer. So it's great to have your insights, your research helping us deal with these thorny questions, but also your support, because I think that's really powerful, actually, coming from the digital sector and the technologists, to say, you know, we can design all this stuff and we can help you with all of this stuff, but actually, let's remember digital won't work for everyone. So thank you for being our ally in that. Right, Michelle, you're the last of our panel speakers now. Don't be alarmed. Towards the end of your 5 minutes, I'm going to be spotlighting everybody back so that we can have a kind of panel arrangement of the panel members, but I'll do that around about 4 minutes, so that will give you the indicator that we'll ask you to wrap up. So Michelle's joining us from the Northeast Local Enterprise Partnership, and Michelle has been doing lots of work around digital inclusion, but particularly related to the skills and employability education piece. So over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Carol. Good morning, everybody. Yes, so I have responsibility within the LEP for skills, employment, inclusion and progression. Digital inclusion or digital exclusion has been a big topic over the last few years, but has particularly come to the fore, as for everybody, during the pandemic. And with the encouragement of Carol, particularly through her work, wider work and her role on our boards, is something that we really are starting to shout about now. The LEP's main role is to drive economic growth, create more and better jobs, but with the ultimate ambition that everybody in our community thrives. And digital exclusion, we think, is one of the biggest barriers to that. You know, how do we drive a leveled up economy when we have potentially around 200,000 people across our communities that have not accessed or cannot access the internet? So we know that digital skills are increasingly important. They connect people to education and training. They connect people to better jobs, social interactions and public services, as well as providing access to cheaper products and services online. But there is actually no one single definition at the moment for a digital skills framework. We think that this is something that needs to be addressed going forward, so that everybody, both from the education perspective, but also an employment perspective, can sort of define what we mean by these digital skills, or the perceived lack of them that we have across our sort of business communities. we commissioned some research earlier this year through New Skills Consulting, and I just wanted to highlight a few things that came out of that research that talk not just about the sort of impact of the COVID pandemic, but some of the broader issues that are sort of impacting us and the wider impacts, if you like, of digital exclusion. So we know it's creating challenges and widening the achievement gap in education. That's already been mentioned by Amanda, particularly, and it's particularly exacerbated from learners from more disadvantaged backgrounds, as well as impacting on academic performance and results. It therefore then impacts on progress into employment and access to good quality jobs. It increases the gap between, for those who are already furthest from the labour market. Many employment support services or clients lack the devices, skills and confidence to search and apply for jobs online and complete online interviews. A lack of digital skills presents a major barrier to clients being able to secure work, even in lower skilled and entry-level jobs. And the move up the career ladder from low skilled to high skilled jobs comes with an increasing demand for specific digital skills. So from an employer perspective, these are really important. 92% of businesses say that digital skills are important for all of their employees. 82% of current online vacancies highlight that they are required to have digital skills. And 28% of North East employers with skills gaps say that basic digital skills need improving. And 23% say businesses say that their own employers lack basic digital skills. So this is, you know, a challenge when we come to sort of driving productivity, when we're driving business growth, when we're driving increases in employment levels. The lack of digital skills is a huge issue and has been exacerbated by COVID. I do think, and this has been mentioned a few times, that it's such a large and complex issue. There is no one government department, despite sort of increased lobbying from North East MPs and from LEP's combined authorities. There is no one department taking responsibility for this. It doesn't land with DWP. It doesn't necessarily sit with DFE. It doesn't sit with BEIS comfortably. So we recognise that it needs interventions across lots and lots of groups, and a coordinated response from business, education, voluntary and community sector and the public sector is needed. However, I'm going to try and end on a bit of a positive note. I do think there is increased momentum. I think people are starting to hear and listen. I think that we are not, I think we have a real opportunity to roll out successful approaches across the region to have meaningful impact. So I do feel like the tide is turning, and we are starting to sort of hear or see cracks in sort of government in terms of, you know, they are listening to the collective lobbying we all are doing. So I'm trying to end on a bit of a positive. We know it's tough, but I do think people are starting to listen now.
That's great. Thank you, Michelle. And I think it is good. And I think, you know, today and the work that people have shared with us and the conversations that we'll have later will also feed into that, because I do think the tide is turning. I think there's been enough people, including you and me, Michelle, banging on about it for long enough. Erica, Isabel and others, Jacob, we've all been banging on about it for long enough, and we will continue to beat that drum, because this ain't going away, and it really is a massive issue in terms of social justice, in terms of poverty, in terms of human rights, and therefore we cannot give up this fight. Right, that's my call to arms for the day. Time for questions. I'm going to try and keep this within 10 minutes to make up a bit of lost time. So I think I've got everybody apart from Paul Hewitson, because I need Paul to turn his video on so that he can join us in the panel. But the first question, which has 5 votes on Slido, is what can be done to better engage with the digital sector to involve and inspire them to contribute to the challenges faced? Adam, I think that is one that I'm going to come to you with first, and then perhaps Michelle, just to warn you.
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and there's I'm not going to lie, it's a tricky one. If I had a clear answer, we wouldn't need to ask this question, because I would be shouting it from every available rooftop. But there's currently a bit of a reckoning with social justice happening in the tech sector. And a great number of people on the ground, even in what might seem like very large, very sort of monolithic, faceless tech companies, are people who are deeply concerned, who are willing to put the work in to do the right thing. The problem, or is part of the problem from my experience, is that the kind of sort of educational background and experiential background that leads one to become someone who develops technology for a living is not necessarily the kind of background that opens one's eyes to social injustice. And so really, this is where lobbying, this is where campaigning comes in to kind of apply that pressure and encourage people who are designing services to actually look at this problem and take it seriously. But also, there's something to be said bringing the wealth of knowledge that the VCSE sector has to technologists and working with them to work out what we actually want from technologists in terms of the design of accessible services, in terms of the design of services so that they are pluralistic and support non-digital options, in terms of designing services for people with lower digital skills. Those are all quite difficult questions, and they're not necessarily questions that tech experts right now are equipped to solve. But in collaboration with people with your collective experience, I think they could come to some of those answers.
Thank you very much, Adam. There's a question here, which I want to come to next, because a couple of people have already touched upon this. What if people really don't want to be digitally included? How do we address their exclusion? Who wants to answer that question? Go on, Isabel.
So for me, the first thing is to understand why somebody feels like they don't want to go online. So this is part of the motivation and confidence question, because it can be complex. It can be because of a poor experience of being at school. It can be because of fear that you might break the tech. So it's important to understand why somebody's saying, oh, it's not for me. Not just to accept that on face value. And then in my presentation, I talked about digital inclusion being embedded in other things. And I think that's really crucial. Often if you talk about digital and digital skills, it's really off-putting to people. So it's finding ways, finding the hooks, finding the interests. You know, is somebody interested in fishing, or, you know, and you can look at YouTube videos. It is really about finding that hook. But ultimately, it's not about forcing people to go online. There should be choice. And, you know, Good Things Foundation, we absolutely support that idea that there needs to always be another option. And this isn't about forcing people to go online. It's making sure that everyone has the ability to make an informed choice about whether they want to be online, and ensuring that they are safe and understand how to be safe. You know, that has to underpin everything. But yeah, it's complex, and but we shouldn't shy away from trying to understand what's behind an individual saying, well, it's not for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Leading on from something you've said there, Isabel, how do we get the balance between supporting people who are who have less confidence and less skills, and patronising them on the issue? Any thoughts on that, anybody? Go on, Erica.
Yeah, I think that one of the big keys here is ensuring that the delivery of any digital support is appropriate and sensitive to the needs of individuals. And again, just to go back to what I and many others have said throughout this discussion, the VCSE sector can be key to that. Like, you know, the sector's already providing so much support to vulnerable people and people who perhaps you know, need that additional support in, and that there's an understanding there of how to be sensitive and how to be sensitive to specific needs of specific communities, and the recognition that, you know, it isn't one size fits all. You don't deal with one individual or group of individuals in the same way necessarily as you deal with others. So I think that we looked a lot at this in the research. You know, classroom-based programs won't work for everybody, and they'll put a lot of people off maybe. So yeah, it's just being really sensitive to them and making sure that that delivery agent is really sensitive to them as well.
And I think the other thing that has been touched upon in different bits of research and thinking around this is the importance of kind of peer support and training up people that have been through that process themselves to then go on and support others, because they have that understanding and the sensitivity because they were there themselves. And I think that's something that the sector does really well in terms of encouraging and building capacities within communities for individuals to support each other. This is going to be my last question, but I should say that, you know, we are going to go into breakout rooms very shortly, and so that's an opportunity to really delve into and ask more questions of the speakers as well. So unfortunately, we've had to squeeze this Q&A session a little bit. So the last question, and I think I've picked this one because it is so pertinent to the sector, which is how can we ensure that the expansion of digital services doesn't remove the kind of reason for being for voluntary and community sector in terms of that community interaction and human contact? Who would like to respond to that? What can the sector do to make sure that, you know, as the world is going digital, the core services that we offer face-to-face and human support do not get forgotten? Adam.
I appreciate that I am something of an outsider coming into this discussion, but nobody else put their hand up first, so here we are. To my mind, there is a very real risk in digitalization of what in my circles we might call techno-saviorism. The idea that if we add technology into a situation, it will automatically make things better and automatically enhance people's opportunities. And it's very important to recognize that that does, almost by definition, at least for the time being, with the technology that we currently have, come with a risk of really damaging that human connective element. And so what I would suggest is that when we're thinking about services, it comes back to this idea of being pluralistic and thinking about multiple ways of doing things and making sure that that human element is still there, because doing things digitally and especially automating things is impersonal and there's no getting around that. To my mind, the answer is that digitalization always has a cost in terms of that. And that's one of the reasons why we should be keen to preserve more traditional offline ways of doing and being.
Definitely. And I think, you know, actually there's a real opportunity for the sector, because we do that human interaction, community support at a local level. It's a real opportunity to say, we need this more than ever as the world is getting more and more digital. And so it can add actual strength to the offer that the voluntary sector is making to society. So at that point, I'm going to say thank you ever so much to all our speakers and our panel members. They're not off the hook yet because they are going to be helping to facilitate the discussion groups. So let me just pull this slide up. There are 6 discussion groups, the topics are there, and in a moment Anne is going to open the breakout rooms and you can choose which conversation you would like to take part in. And we're going to ask you to have a bit of time to have some chat with your speaker and panel member about the particular perspective, so an opportunity for you to ask them any further questions or explore in a bit more detail. And then we're going to ask you to answer these 3 questions, which is, how can policymakers and service designers best engage with the voluntary sector to ensure that equitable access? What do you, the sector, need from funders and commissioners to support you to tackle digital exclusion in your communities? And what do you need to encourage collaboration with other organisations? So we're going to ask you to choose your breakout rooms in a minute. Once you're in your breakout rooms, we're going to allow you to have a quick